It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Welcome to the Happy Families podcast. My name is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of 9 books about raising happy families and the co-host and parenting expert on Channel 9's hit TV show Parental Guidance. Also a dad to 6 kids. Just recently, we did something unusual. We did something a bit different online. We conducted an online conference called Breaking Point, very much about the state of mental health in young people around the country and what we can do to improve things because, things aren't looking that great. I was absolutely delighted and really honoured to have the opening speaker for our online conference as the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollonds. Anne Hollonds commenced as National Children's Commissioner in November 2020. It's a 5-year appointment. Before she was appointed to the role of National Children's Commissioner, she was the Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, which is an independent authority run by the Australian government responsible for conducting research and providing advice on child and family wellbeing. And in that role, she was also the Director of the Australian Gambling Research Centre. And for 23 years was a CEO of government and non-government organisations focused on research and policy and service delivery in health and education and social services, has 2 adult daughters, 3 grandchildren, and has just done so much work, MBA, strategy and leadership sessions at Harvard and Stanford universities. We're talking top shelf, as you would expect for the National Children's Commissioner. In the online digital conference Breaking Point, Anne and I spoke for about an hour about so many things related to our young people and their mental health. It was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I'm going to share with you an extract of that in today's podcast. Let's start with the question, what is the current state of mental health for young people?
Well, we know that even before COVID, Justin, that the rates of mental health issues for children and young people had been increasing. And, it's hard to remember back before the pandemic, but what was happening then was that, regularly the government was announcing more and more funding for what was called youth mental health services because of the increasing demand. But I remember thinking at the time it never seemed to be quite enough. And of course, then the pandemic hit, and it kind of what the pandemic did was it amplified the broken systems out there. The fact that kids weren't able to get what they needed, and we saw during the pandemic increased rates of presentations to emergency departments of much younger children with much more serious mental health issues like eating disorders and suicidality. And that was also shown through helplines like Kids Helpline, that there was this uptick during COVID. Since COVID, of course, we've seen that long tail of the pandemic's effect, which we all predicted, and for children, and that is we've seen continued high rates of anxiety, school refusal. We just had a Senate inquiry about kids who are too anxious to go to school, and also problems like eating disorders and so forth. On the positive side, I guess what's happened is that now the discussion about mental health issues is much more mainstream. So we are able to have these conversations, but unfortunately, we haven't kept up with the services for children and young people, and particularly I'm concerned about services for kids 12 and under.
So, Anne, when you describe that situation, one thing that I hear from parents time and time again is that when it comes to this breaking point idea, they just can't get their kids into a psychologist. It's almost impossible to get the mental health access that they require, whether the kids are under 12 or over 12. It just seems that wait lists are enormous. And then, of course, once you get your child into a psychologist, if that therapeutic relationship isn't ideal, if the child doesn't click with the psychologist, we know from research that the stronger that therapeutic alliance, the more likely it is that we get good outcomes in that therapeutic context. So the kids get in, they don't like the psychologist, and the parent says, well, I can't go back to square one because I'm going to be 18 months down the track before I finally find the psychological help that my child needs. Where do you go, not necessarily from your view as the National Children's Commissioner, but where do you go as a parent who is just crumbling under this weight and desperate for their child to get help. What options do they have?
Well, it's really, really hard, Justin. I mean, I've spoken to families that have been unable to get help in the public system for 11 and 12-year-olds who are suicidal. I mean, that is to me shocking. They
Devastating.
were told to go find a private psychiatrist, which, like we know there's not enough of them. There's not enough that are psychiatrists and psychologists that are trained to work with children. It's like 10% or less have the training to work with children. But also, of course, there's the cost. So, it is really hard. And I know from a personal experience in my own family of a child that was struggling to return to school after COVID, that getting help for children with anxiety, even in a big city, even with a family that has all the resources available, is near impossible. And, if you go out of the big cities and you're in regional and remote areas, you can pretty much forget it. So, it's absolutely a failure, I believe, of our governments to leave families in this dire situation. And it is a sign that we're not making child wellbeing the priority it should be in this country. But your question was, what should parents do if they can't get the help? Well, all I can say is just you have to keep trying. You have to keep banging down those doors. I mean, that is our job as parents, to get the help for the children that they need. And hopefully eventually something will open up. But look, the other thing parents should do, of course, is to be there for their child. Don't underestimate your own value, even when it comes to teenagers. They do need very strong parental relationships. And in order for you to be able to help your child, you've got to, of course, look after your own mental health and well-being. And so, you need to address whatever issues you have. And it could even be things like, as adults, we're all addicted to devices. And we have to really, I think, put a mirror up to ourselves. And I think we need to focus on building that very strong relationship with each child, like separately, not children as a group. We need to know our children so that we can be attuned to their needs. And just don't give up. Don't give up trying to find that help.
And I really want to talk about the trends, especially as they apply to social media. But a couple of things that you've highlighted, I'd really like to go a little deeper on those. The first that I want to pick up on is my understanding, as I've looked at research from right around the world, my understanding is that providing parenting skills and parenting tools to adults, and even providing parents with the help that they might need, not just for their own issues, but for their children's issues, seems to be far more adaptive, far more helpful than getting kids into therapy. I'll give you an example of what I mean, and then I'll ask for your reaction to what I'm describing. If I'm working with an 8-year-old or even a 13-year-old who is dealing with anxiety or is emotionally dysregulated, has some really big challenges, and I'm working with them at, 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon, the likelihood of them holding on to these skills that I've tried to practice with them in a clinical setting at 5:30 on Thursday night when everything's going haywire is practically zero. I mean, even most adults struggle to do that. Because I want to get a little bit nitty-gritty for just a moment, if I can, Anne. We've been talking about these trends with increased mental health challenges for our young people. What do you think are the central forces that are driving these trends? If you look at society right now, why are we where we are from a mental health perspective?
Well, I'd be very rich if I had that answer, wouldn't I? We are all scratching our heads about this, about why, and I think it is multi-layered. Often, I think, though, we jump to blaming social media for the problem. While there are certainly issues with social media, by the way, for adults as well as children, and social media addictions, I don't think that's the whole story. I guess it's been well articulated what some of the issues are about sort of the cyberbullying thing, and also the comparison, the sense of sort of my life is not as good as someone else's on social media piece. But I think it's the other thing that there are a lot of things that have changed. The internet itself, putting aside social media, has allowed kids to become more exposed to a range of things in the world that they would previously not have been exposed to. And I think it's when I'm talking just basic information about what's going on in the world. And it was struck me recently, I heard that a big survey of young people just recently found that the top 3 things that kids are worried about, there were, number 1 was cost of living, number 2 was mental health issues, and number 3 was climate change. And I think that really says to us as adults that, the idea that kids can be protected from what's going on around in the world, and we just don't talk to them about it, just they let them go out and play. That doesn't work. Children these days will know from a very early age about what's going on in the world, and again, I think it puts a lot more pressure on us as parents to be talking with them about this, helping them to make sense of it. Because if you're just seeing negative news, and there's been a lot lately that we've been worried about, of course. If you're just sitting on your device and streaming this all these bad news stories on your own, as a child, you don't have the maturity to put all of that in perspective, right? So as adults, for example, we might have been in shock over what happened at Bondi Junction on Saturday, but we have some capacity to rationalise about it, put it in some kind of context and perspective. Children don't necessarily have that ability, and it can seem much more catastrophic for a young person. I mean, this is where parents really have a job to do, in my view, to be able to sit down and have an open conversation, to convey to kids that it is okay to talk about these things, and that as a parent, I also feel sad and shocked, and I don't have all the answers, but let's have the conversation, and I'd like to hear what you're thinking, how did this affect you, and, to open up about it, because that helps the children to process the bad news. And I'm not sure that as parents we've really understood how important our role is in an environment where the kids are exposed much, much earlier to a whole lot of stuff that we didn't know about till, we were over 21.
And when I hear you say that, I think that the 24-hour news cycle has got to be a contributor to the stress, especially that our older kids are experiencing. But I can't help but think that we're creating this ourselves. I feel like in so many ways we are our own worst enemy. We've got the screens going all the time. We've got the news going all the time. Our society has built itself around this need to know and need to know now.
Yeah.
You referenced Bondi and the awful tragedy that occurred there. In the days following that, I was asked to do countless media interviews about how to talk to the kids about it. Several of those were on the television. I'm sure you had the same experience. And so you're sitting in a TV studio, or you're sitting online watching the TV programming. And it was one thing for me to hear about it and read about it across the weekend. It was another thing entirely to start watching footage that people had recorded on their phones of this man doing what he was doing.
Yeah, the imagery, I think, it gets to you more than the words. This is the thing.
So profoundly.
And we've got CCTV, iPhone images. We get everything instantly, right? And again, I don't think that we've really come to terms with what effect that has on us psychologically. I'll tell you what happened to me on Saturday. So I had my little grandchildren with me, 5 and 8. And I saw it on my news feed, and I was really shocked. I didn't know how to process this in the moment. And I thought, well, I'm just not going to turn the television off. And of course, they're still quite young, so they don't have their own phone. So they did not know about this until the next day. And I made that decision that I needed time to process what had happened as an adult first before talking with kids about it. So, I think that we need to recognise that it is so confronting sometimes, that even as adults, but then it's going to be even more confronting and difficult to understand for children, and that's where we as parents come in.
From the Happy Families online digital conference Breaking Point, that is the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollonds. You can find more of that conversation at happyfamilies.com.au. Just go to the shop and look for the Breaking Point Digital Conference. I think that you'll find so much there of tremendous value. Tomorrow on the Happy Families podcast, we look at this week in parenting. We're going to take a look at somebody who is arguing that vaping could actually be good for kids and that we need vaping rooms for our kids, and also a new nicotine threat that is taking over schools. That and more this week in parenting is on the Happy Families podcast tomorrow. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rowland from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. For more information about making your family happier, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.